irrefutable evidence. Shapiro, exposed and losing his credibility, is left speechless, unable to offer any defense, leaving the entire studio in stunned silence in an atmosphere so tense it was almost suffocating. What did Jasmine finally say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights in the CNN studio dimmed slightly as the broadcast went live, and for a moment, the tension in the air was almost physical, coiled like a spring, waiting to snap. This wasn't just another political segment. It was a collision course between two opposing forces who had, for months, circled each other through headlines, sound bites, and social media jabs. On one side of the glossy white table sat Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator with millions of followers and a reputation built on speed-talking takedowns. He wore his trademark suit like armor and his smile like a challenge. On the other side sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, calm but visibly coiled, not with anger, but with clarity. Her presence was different, grounded, unflinching. This wasn't theater for her. This was personal. This was lived experience being weighed against performance. The moderator welcomed viewers across the nation and announced the topic of the night. Free speech or hate speech? Where is the line? The question wasn't new, but the stakes had changed. In recent months, hate crimes had risen, protests had turned violent, online rhetoric had crossed into real-world harm, and in that moment, with two voices at the center of America's cultural divide, this wasn't a debate about theory. It was a battle over what truth looks like in an age where lies wear suits. Ben Shapiro moved first. He didn't hesitate. He never does. With his signature rhythm and a practiced ease, he leaned in and delivered the opening blow. Let's not pretend we don't know what this is, he said, voice calm but sharp enough to cut. We're living in an age where free speech is under attack, not from governments, but from professional victims. The left has become a fire hose of outrage, and politicians like Ms. Crockett here, well, they've turned virtue signaling into a full-time career. He smiled just long enough to let the barb sink in. Congresswoman Crockett is a passionate defender of democracy, to be sure. A firebrand, you might say. But sometimes that fire gets out of control. Sometimes the very people claiming to protect the truth are the first to burn it down. There was a flicker of laughter from a small section of the crowd. Nervous, almost rehearsed. The kind that doesn't come from belief, but from loyalty. The moderator didn't interrupt. The camera stayed tight on Jasmine. She didn't shift. She didn't frown. She simply waited until the last echo of his voice disappeared, and then she moved. Slowly, deliberately. Her fingers folded together as she leaned into her mic, not to shout, but to be heard. Thank you for reminding us, Ben, that the loudest voice in the room is not always the most honest. The words dropped with weight. No fire, no fury, just a quiet indictment that felt heavier than any insult. Free speech is sacred, but it's not an excuse to slander or to mislead millions just because outrage sells. Her eyes didn't leave his. When you twist facts about communities that are already under siege, when you monetize fear disguised as commentary, you're not defending liberty. You're feeding something else entirely. There was a stillness in the room, like the breath before impact. Free speech doesn't mean free lies, and it doesn't mean giving a platform to those who punch down, then pretend it's a debate. For a moment, even the hum of the studio equipment seemed to fall silent. Shapiro blinked, twice. The moderator glanced between them but said nothing. Something had shifted. The ground was no longer neutral. This wasn't a back-and-forth exchange. It had become something far more raw. The exposure of what happens when those with microphones confuse provocation with principle, and the moment someone refuses to let them get away with it. But Shapiro wasn't finished, not by a long shot. As Crockett's words settled into the room like smoke after a controlled burn, he leaned forward, his expression shifting from smug amusement to sharp-edged accusation. And what he said next wasn't just a counterpoint. It was a calculated detonation. Ben Shapiro adjusted the cuffs of his blazer with theatrical precision before locking eyes with the audience and delivering his next line with icy deliberation. "Let's not forget who we're dealing with," he said, every syllable crisp, cold, and aimed. This is the same congresswoman who mocked a sitting governor with a disability, who referred to Greg Abbott, a paraplegic, as Hot Wheels on social media. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He was no longer debating. He was prosecuting. That's not a slip. That's not satire. That's targeted cruelty from someone who claims to speak for the marginalized. He let the accusation hang in the air like a slow-moving guillotine, then pivoted toward the camera with the rehearsed cadence of a man who'd spent years making his outrage profitable. You don't get to play champion of justice while mocking those who can't walk. You don't get to preach inclusion while you laugh at a man in a wheelchair. Turning back to Jasmine, his eyes hardened with performative disgust. Tell me, Congresswoman, what part of that joke was for the people? Or was it just for applause? There was a moment, half a heartbeat, where the room forgot to breathe. The studio lights caught beads of sweat forming on the brows of the production crew. A few audience members shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to clap, gasp, or look away. What had begun as a political exchange now teetered on the edge of something much more personal, much more dangerous, a public reckoning painted as moral outrage. But for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't new. This wasn't shocking. It was familiar. The way truth gets distorted by those who never had to live beneath its weight. She didn't recoil. She didn't fire back instantly. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, to simmer, to become its own kind of statement. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let hypocrisy wear a halo. If Shapiro wanted to drag her into the courtroom of public morality, she would bring the full case file on him, unedited, uncensored, and impossible to ignore. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't smirk. She simply reached for the tablet beside her, smoothly, almost quietly, but with the kind of control that turns a courtroom still. Then her voice cut through the rising tension with surgical clarity. You want to talk about cruelty, Ben? Let's talk about what lives on your own platform. With a tap of her finger, the studio's central screen flickered to life. A video clip rolled, one that had circulated online but had never been played like this. On national television, in front of its own creator. The footage showed Ben Shapiro mocking a transgender teenager's voice during a Daily Wire broadcast. His tone was dismissive, exaggerated, theatrical. The crowd in the background laughed. And then came the next clip, quieter, more insidious. Shapiro on air again, discussing children with autism, describing them as social liabilities within the context of public education policy. No punchline, just cold detachment, as if human worth could be graphed on a fiscal chart. The images hit the studio like a silent explosion. No one moved, but something in the air had shifted. Decency had been replaced with disgust, and no one could pretend otherwise. Crockett let the silence stretch, not to dominate the moment, but to give the truth its own room to breathe. Then she turned back to him, not to yell, but to sentence. You don't get to build an empire on belittling the vulnerable and then step onto this stage pretending to be the moral compass of the room. Her voice didn't rise. It sank into the room like a weight too heavy to lift. The audience fractured almost instantly. Some shook their heads, shielding their eyes from the screen like they were trying to unsee something they'd once defended. Others muttered in defense, "It's satire. It's taken out of context." But their voices lacked force, like they no longer fully believed their own excuses. In the front row, a mother with a son on the autism spectrum sat frozen, lips pressed tightly together, eyes locked on Crockett. She wasn't clapping. She was listening. And the moderator? She didn't speak. Her polished neutrality had faltered. No cue card could guide her through what had just happened. Shapiro didn't reply right away. His expression, so often smug or condescending, was still, but not calm. He stared at the monitor with the same face a man wears when the courtroom suddenly turns against him. And in that silence, Jasmine didn't smirk. She didn't lean in. She just looked out across the audience and let them sit with what they'd seen. This, her presence said without words, is the kind of cruelty I've been told to ignore, to rise above, to let slide in the name of civility. But she didn't. Not this time, and not tonight. Because tonight, cruelty met consequence, and the nation was watching. But Jasmine wasn't done laying bare the double standards. Because the most dangerous kind of censorship isn't loud and obvious. It's dressed in contracts, enforced in silence, and carried out by those who preach freedom the loudest. She didn't raise her voice, but something shifted in her tone, like a warning just before the floor gives way. Jasmine Crockett's expression was steady, not angry, but resolute, as if she were about to lift the veil on a truth too many were willing to ignore. She didn't turn to Shapiro this time. She spoke to the audience, to the cameras, to the millions of Americans watching who'd been sold a version of free speech that only worked one way. When Candace Owens said something Ben didn't like, she didn't get a rebuttal. She got a gag order. The room didn't gasp. It held its breath. She didn't get invited to a debate. She got silenced by her own platform. And then, without flourish or drama, she tapped the screen in front of her. Behind them, the studio monitor illuminated a digital document. Legal language, signatures, confidentiality clauses. A section highlighted in yellow read plainly, "Subject is prohibited from addressing the topic of Israeli foreign policy on any Daily Wire-affiliated platform or public broadcast." One name was unredacted. Candace Owens. Jasmine let the audience take it in. Let the truth settle into their skin. This wasn't a theory. It wasn't a Twitter rumor. It was paper. It was policy. It was proof. Here's the truth. When Candace criticized Israeli policy, when she stepped outside the party line, Daily Wire didn't defend her right to speak. They punished her for it. They banned her from addressing the issue publicly, even as Ben publicly pretended to welcome debate. Her voice didn't rise, but the steel inside it was unmistakable. She wasn't lobbing an opinion. She was delivering evidence, the kind that rewrites reputations. Shapiro shifted for the first time in minutes, not dramatically, but enough. His jaw flexed. His hand adjusted his tie. But he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. He knew what was on that screen, and he knew what it meant for the image he had cultivated for over a decade. The audience didn't react with claps or cheers. They didn't need to. Their stillness spoke louder. A few leaned forward. A few pulled out their phones. And one woman in the front row, maybe a journalist, maybe just a mother, whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. And then Jasmine turned the knife, not with malice, but with clarity. This is the freedom Ben defends? A freedom that depends on whether your opinion aligns with his funding? Her voice softened, not to retreat, but to draw the truth even closer. Tell me, America, is that freedom of speech, or is it just speech for sale? And in that moment, even the cameras seemed unsure where to look, because the spotlight wasn't on Ben anymore. It was on the system, and it was burning. The moment her final question hit the air, is that freedom of speech or just speech for sale? Ben Shapiro broke his silence, and in doing so, he walked straight into the very trap he had helped build. Ben's response came not with hesitation, but with heat, fast, reflexive, defensive. The carefully measured tone he wore like a second skin cracked open, replaced by something sharper, more exposed. "That's a lie," he snapped, his voice ringing through the studio with the kind of force that draws eyes for all the wrong reasons. Candace wasn't silenced. She left on her own terms. She made her choices and we respected them. The words tumbled out fast, but something in them betrayed panic disguised as confidence. He gestured, dismissively, toward the document on the screen, his hand slicing the air like he could will the damage away. There was no gag order. No one at Daily Wire censors anyone. We encourage internal debate. We always have. He leaned forward, the volume rising just enough to feel like a crack in the dam. "You don't get to rewrite history because it suits your narrative, Congresswoman." And with that, the table between them stopped being furniture. It became a fault line. Jasmine didn't react to his anger. She didn't even look surprised. She moved with the calm weight of someone who'd seen this kind of unraveling before, except now, the unraveling wasn't hers. Her fingers slid across the table, placing a single printed sheet just inches from his hand. At the same time, the studio screen behind them shifted again, the tension rising as the next layer of truth was revealed. Not shouted, but shown. This time it wasn't theory or accusation, it was documentation. The email appeared in full on the broadcast screen. The studio lights seemed to dim as if even they knew something irreversible had just surfaced. A bolded subject line, "Containment Strategy, Owens." The sender, Benjamin Shapiro. The language beneath was unambiguous, deliberate. Given the sensitivity of the issue and the damage to our pro-Israel stance, Candace must refrain from further commentary. I'll handle the language. Make it final. The words didn't need context. They were the context. A hush swept across the studio like a cold wind through glass. This wasn't an opinion or interpretation. This was the very proof Ben had just denied existed, in his own words, with a timestamp and digital trail. In the second row, someone whispered, "Oh my God," but no one dared speak louder. Shapiro stared at the screen, his posture unchanged, but his face a map of tension, jaw tight, eyes fixed, lips parted slightly as if reaching for a rebuttal that simply wasn't there. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. There was no victory in her eyes, only gravity. She looked at him, not with smugness, but with the unmistakable disappointment of someone watching a person unravel under the weight of their own contradiction. You didn't silence her for lying, Ben. You silenced her for telling a truth that didn't serve your brand. Her voice, low and steady, filled the space like a final ruling. No applause followed, no immediate reaction, just silence thick with realization. Because what the audience had just witnessed wasn't a debate point lost. It was something more damning, a breach between a man's persona and his practice. A moment when the scaffolding of self-righteousness collapsed under the simple pressure of his own words. And in that collapse, the truth wasn't just exposed, it was undeniable. The email hit like a hammer, but it was the echo that revealed the fracture. Because the truth didn't just expose a man, it split the room. The studio didn't erupt, it ruptured. A slow, jagged tear through the fragile illusion of neutrality that had held the room together until that moment. On the left side, a cluster of Shapiro loyalists sprang to their feet, their voices rising in overlapping waves of protest. "That's doctored," someone shouted. "Context matters," another yelled, desperation bleeding through every syllable. Their faces were tight with anger, not just at the email, but at what it revealed, that the man they followed with unwavering loyalty was no longer untouchable. On the right, it was a different eruption. Crockett's supporters stood without waiting for a cue. Their applause thundered, not out of celebration, but vindication. Some clapped with tears in their eyes. Others simply stood, arms crossed, as if witnessing long-awaited justice being delivered live. Phone screens lit up across the room, capturing the moment, immortalizing it before the world could twist it. Hashtags were typed in real time. The battle wasn't just in the room anymore. It was on the internet, in living rooms, in text threads from coast to coast. The moderator struggled to pull the show back into format, her voice thin against the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we need to allow the discussion to continue." But her pleas evaporated into the chaos. The energy no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the rupture. The tension no longer simmered beneath the surface. It ruled the room. The stage lights flickered faintly, almost as if reacting to the volatility in the air. What was meant to be a debate had become something far more dangerous, a moment of truth that refused to be managed. And then Jasmine moved, not physically, but emotionally. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't raise her voice. She let the storm swirl around her, standing rooted like someone who'd weathered far worse than noise. When she finally spoke, her words sliced through the uproar, not by volume, but by weight. "I don't want applause," she said. Her voice didn't need a mic. It carried because it came from somewhere deeper than strategy. "I want awareness." The room didn't go silent, it froze. "I don't want the noise, I want the reckoning." No flourish, no performance, just raw, direct truth. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not for approval, but for accountability. "This isn't about me. It's about every voice that's been buried so that power could keep speaking uninterrupted." And just like that, the clapping faltered, not from disagreement, but from understanding. People lowered their hands slowly, as if realizing applause had never been enough. Crockett hadn't come to win a room. She came to expose what that room had too often concealed. And in that moment, without raising her voice, she had taken back the floor and given it to the truth. But just as the silence was beginning to settle, just as the truth was finally allowed to breathe, Ben Shapiro struck back, not with words of defense, but with a weapon as old as politics itself: manipulation by omission. There was a flicker in Shapiro's eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but calculation. The kind of calculation that happens in milliseconds when power senses it's slipping through the cracks. He gave a near-invisible nod to the control booth. A beat later, the screen behind them changed again. Gone were the documents, the emails, the paper trail of accountability. In their place, video footage, grainy but clear, flashed across the giant monitor. Jasmine Crockett stood on a church stage in South Dallas, fire in her voice, conviction in her posture. She spoke to a crowd, not with rehearsed slogans, but with raw, unfiltered urgency. The video, however, had been cut with surgical intent. It skipped the full speech and jumped directly to one line. "We don't owe silence to those who thrive on our suffering. We will confront them." Loudly. Then the screen froze on her face mid-sentence, weaponizing her expression. Passion stripped of context. Emotion framed as menace. The air in the studio tightened again. Shapiro leaned in, every syllable sharpened like a blade. "This," he said coldly, "is not advocacy. This is incitement. This is what happens when rage is given a microphone and no boundaries. She isn't defending justice. She's threatening anyone who disagrees with her." His words weren't shouted. They were delivered with the quiet venom of someone trying to turn truth into something dangerous. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't have to. He was speaking to the audience now, both in the room and across the country. He was counting on their unfamiliarity with her, on their distance from the lived pain behind her words. Some members of the crowd murmured. A few leaned toward one another, confused, uncertain. The footage had been carefully chosen for maximum ambiguity. It was the oldest trick in the playbook: sever context, inject fear, and dress it as concern. Shapiro had played this game before. He knew exactly how to seed doubt without ever proving guilt. And for a brief moment, it worked. The audience, hungry for clarity, leaned into the narrative he offered them. But just as the crowd began to shift uncomfortably, teetering on the edge of doubt, something unexpected happened. Not on stage, but behind the scenes, where truth often dies quietly, or gets resurrected by those still brave enough to speak. In the narrow shadowed control booth suspended above the studio like a judge's perch, the room was humming, monitors flickering, audio feeds layered into a dense digital symphony. And then a single frame froze on one technician's screen. He leaned in instinctively, eyes scanning the waveform beneath the video. He wasn't just a tech, he was an editor by training, and what he saw didn't align with the rhythm of uncut truth. Something was wrong. The pacing was off. The waveform was clipped in a pattern he recognized instantly. Mid-sentence cuts, overlaid transitions too smooth to be accidental. He dropped his pen, leaned into the comm system, and spoke directly into the director's ear. "That's not the original cut," he said, quiet but firm. "That segment's been altered. Context removed, lines skipped. It's a splice." The words hung in the control room like a live wire. The director, seasoned and usually unshakable, snapped her head toward the master playback screen. Her eyes flicked across the metadata, timecode mismatches, markers out of sequence. Then she turned to the untouched copy of the original footage still queued in their backup system. There, Jasmine's voice carried a completely different message. Calls for nonviolent resistance, appeals for civic engagement, even a line that said explicitly, "We do not meet hate with hate, we meet it with visibility and law." The exact parts that had been erased now screamed louder by their absence. Without waiting for clearance from the producer, the director leaned into her own mic. "We need to roll the full version, now." Her voice was flat, direct, and without negotiation. She raised her hand and signaled to the control floor, two fingers rotating in a circle, the universal sign to override the feed. There was a pause. Then the main studio screen flickered. Shapiro was still speaking, unaware. But behind him, the edited clip was already dissolving, and the raw, uncut truth was about to take the stage. This time, with nothing left out and nowhere left to hide. And just as the manipulated footage threatened to cloud the air with suspicion, Jasmine Crockett did what few dared to do on live television. She demanded the truth, raw and uninterrupted, with all of America watching. She turned toward the control booth, her voice clear, calm, and louder than any outrage in the room. There was no hesitation, no tremor. Only resolve, spoken like a verdict. I request the full unedited video, right now, on this stage, before the American people. Her words cut through the theater of the moment and landed with the force of someone reclaiming a stolen truth. The audience froze, not out of obedience but instinct. Even Shapiro stopped mid-sentence, lips still parted, his rhythm shattered by the certainty in her tone. In the control room above, the director didn't wait for debate. The signal had already come in. They'd seen the real footage. They'd seen the lie. And now, with Crockett's public call, there was no turning back. The screen went black. Then a caption, "Please stand by, technical review in progress." A hush swept through the studio like a vacuum sucking the air from every chest. The lights dimmed slightly, as if the stage itself were holding its breath. For 2 minutes, no one moved. No one spoke. Phones were still, hands were clenched. It wasn't a pause, it was a storm gathering behind a curtain, a reckoning cued in digital files and final timestamps. Crockett stood motionless, her chin raised, her eyes fixed on the screen with the stillness of someone who has nothing to hide. Shapiro stared forward, jaw tense, fingers tapping against the desk. A man realizing control was slipping through the cracks of a narrative he thought he owned. And then, without fanfare, the screen lit up again. No dramatic music, no commentary, just the raw video, dated and time-stamped, playing in real time from the same town hall. This time it wasn't a chopped 12-second clip. It was the full 3-minute segment. Jasmine stood before a crowd of constituents, hands open, not clenched, her voice filled not with rage, but with righteous calm. The missing context came first, her voice steady. We confront injustice not to destroy, but to build. We will not answer hate with hate. We will be loud, yes, but we will be lawful, visible, unapologetic, and peaceful. There was no threat, no incitement, just a firm, impassioned plea for justice. The full quote, now made whole, undermined the narrative Shapiro had just tried to weave seconds before. He didn't need to be interrupted. The video itself was the interruption. It was the exoneration, the exposure, the counterpunch without fists, and the effect was immediate. A woman in the third row exhaled audibly, clutching her chest. A man behind her whispered, "They cut that out?" The sound booth remained dead silent. No direction, no input, just stunned eyes fixed on the feed they now knew had been tampered with before. Shapiro shifted in his seat, shoulders no longer squared. His eyes darted toward the monitor, and for the first time all night, he looked small. Smaller than his rhetoric, smaller than the machine he had built to shape public perception. The power of editing had been his sword, but tonight it had cut back. Crockett didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She just stood in the presence of the truth, now finally restored to its full shape. The screen faded to black again, and this time, the silence didn't feel like suspense. It felt like awe. The moderator, who until then had struggled to regain control, finally stepped in. Her voice came softly, nearly reverent. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, looking between Crockett, the screen, and the audience with a tremble in her breath, "you are witnessing a moment in live television history." No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't the kind of victory you celebrate. It was the kind you absorb, like a verdict handed down from something higher than any headline. A moment where one woman stood still, while the world finally saw what had been done to her in the shadows of post-production and politics. The truth had spoken, not with fire, not with fury, but with clarity. And for once, it wasn't interrupted. And just when the air had barely begun to settle, when the damage from the doctored video had fully turned against him, Jasmine Crockett reached once more into her arsenal. This time not to defend herself, but to expose the rot behind the very empire that claimed the moral high ground. She moved deliberately, not in anger, not in triumph, but with the precision of someone who'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. The camera zoomed in as she unlatched the side pocket of her leather binder and pulled out 2 sheets of paper, crisp, official, marked with signatures. She held them up not for drama, but for evidence. Her tone dropped into something colder now, measured, merciless, surgical. "You speak so freely about integrity, Ben," she began, her eyes never leaving his. "But the money behind your words tells a very different story." She tapped the first document, lifting it between her fingers. "This is a wire transfer record, $275,000 paid to the Daily Wire Media Fund from an Eastern European holding company, Melvona Group. Ring a bell?" She didn't wait for him to answer. Her left hand raised the second document, a printed email highlighted in yellow. "And this is your name, Ben, approving that transaction. Right here with your signature. Dated 4 days after that group was flagged by EU intelligence for contributing to an Austrian ultranationalist pack." The room didn't gasp. It inhaled and never exhaled. The light seemed to dim slightly as the energy shifted yet again. Crockett stepped forward just half a pace, not as intimidation, but as punctuation. "You talk about preserving Western values, but I have in my hands an IRS-verified document confirming this donation was funneled through a political shell organization once tied to far-right militant groups in Vienna." She paused only for a second, then added almost as an afterthought, "These aren't allegations, Ben. They're line items. Traced, certified, publicly verifiable." The moderator blinked twice, visibly rattled, then leaned toward her mic as if to intervene, her voice wavering. "Congresswoman, I think we should—" But it was too late. The story had already detonated. Shapiro didn't speak immediately. His face tightened. His hand fumbled with the corner of the desk, fingers curling slightly. The audience held still, as if waiting to hear what a man says when the curtain is pulled back and there's nothing left behind it. His voice, when it finally came, was thinner than before, lacking its usual certitude, stripped of the polish he'd mastered so well. "This is politically motivated fiction," he muttered, "a desperate smear meant to distract from—" But even he didn't finish the sentence. It was like he knew the ground beneath him was already gone. The audience didn't erupt. They froze, stone still. Not because they were unsure who to believe, but because the force of what had just unfolded was still computing. Some viewers reached for their phones, others sat back as if physically impacted. The producers in the booth began whispering frantically into headsets, their eyes darting between feeds, wondering whether to cut to commercial or keep rolling. But the director made no move. She, like everyone else, recognized what this had become. This was no longer a political sparring match. It was exposure. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply lowered the documents back into her folder, zipped it shut, and looked directly into the camera. Not at Shapiro, not at the moderator, but at the people watching, the ones who'd been told for years that voices like hers were angry, ungrateful, dangerous. "You don't have to believe me," she said, "but you should ask why these documents exist, and why no one on that side ever expected you'd see them." She leaned back in her chair, silent, firm, and utterly unshaken. And in that moment, it was clear. The empire wasn't just bleeding. It had been bought, hollowed out, and repackaged as truth. And tonight, that package had been opened on live television. And just when it seemed the revelations couldn't dig deeper, when the paper trail had scorched the stage and silenced even the most rehearsed voice, an unseen hand behind the glass chose to press play one final time, unleashing something no document could match. A voice caught in the act of betrayal. Without warning, the studio screen blinked once, then went dark. The audience shifted uneasily, unsure if it was a glitch or another scheduled segment. But then, through the overhead speakers, a crackle of audio began to play. No video, just sound. Tinny, raw, unfiltered. A male voice came through, sharp, clipped, unmistakably that of Ben Shapiro. The date stamp was embedded in the top right corner of the screen, 4 days before the televised debate. "We need to label Crockett as a national threat," the voice said. There was a pause, as if he was checking for silence in the room before continuing. "It doesn't matter how much we have to cut from the footage. She needs to be framed as dangerous, loud, emotional, divisive. Make her unpalatable. Make her the villain." Gasps spread like a ripple through the studio. Viewers at home likely missed a heartbeat. And then came the line that changed everything. We need to label Crockett as an enemy of America, no matter how much we have to cut the video to get there. The words didn't just hang in the air. They detonated. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. The tone, the cadence, the intent, it was all there, naked and damning. In the control room, no one admitted who hit play. Later, no one would need to, because the moment had already embedded itself into the bloodstream of the broadcast. This wasn't an edit. This wasn't a leaked memo. This was a man in his own voice, articulating a deliberate strategy to distort truth for political gain. It wasn't just opposition, it was war by narrative. On stage, Shapiro froze. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, because there was no playbook for this. No snark, no deflection, no spreadsheet to hold up. His image pixelated slightly on the monitor behind him, like even the broadcast equipment was distancing itself. His hands sat folded, but lifeless, disconnected from the man who had once wielded control over every frame, every soundbite. And now one sentence had turned his greatest weapon, editing, into a confession. The room was dead silent, no clapping, no gasping, just stillness. Even the moderator seemed paralyzed, her eyes wide, her fingers trembling slightly above the cue cards in her lap. No one had anticipated this. No one had planned for a moment so searing it burned through every assumption of fairness, of process, of neutrality. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett stood. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, with intention. Her movements carried no urgency because truth doesn't rush. It waits, it watches, it rises when everything else collapses. She turned to face the camera, not to the audience, not to Shapiro, but to the millions of people who had been told, time and again, that their voices were too loud, too angry, too threatening to be trusted. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe deeply. She simply spoke. "I am not offended," she said, her voice low and sharp as glass. "I am not hurt." Her eyes didn't waver. "Because this was never about me." She took one step forward. The lights above her seemed to dim in contrast to her clarity. "It's the truth that was assaulted. It's the truth that he abused, turned into a weapon, aimed at the very people it was meant to protect." The camera tightened on her face, catching not defiance, but something more powerful, endurance. There was no need to raise her voice. The silence did that for her. The silence of a studio finally stripped of its illusions. The silence of an audience witnessing propaganda collapse in real time. The silence of a man whose empire of opinion had just been shattered by the sound of his own voice. Jasmine held the gaze of the lens for a moment longer, then spoke one final sentence, measured, unshakable. "This isn't a debate anymore. This is a reckoning, and every lie that built this stage just crumbled beneath it." No one moved, because no one could. The truth wasn't a headline. It wasn't even a scandal. It was a moment that broke the spell and exposed the machinery that kept it spinning. But when the weight of the truth finally pressed down on him, when his carefully curated narrative began to crack under the light, Shapiro broke, not with strategy or reason, but with something more primal: outrage. Ben Shapiro's face flushed a deep, angry red. His chest heaved slightly as he stood up from his seat, almost knocking it over in his haste. His eyes locked onto Jasmine, not with the calculated detachment he had maintained throughout the evening, but with a raw, desperate fury. For the first time, he was visibly rattled. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk so tightly that the knuckles went white. "I am an Orthodox Jew," he spat, his voice louder than it had been all night. "I understand the danger of propaganda, the kind of hatred it can stir. And you, Congresswoman, you are doing exactly what they did. You are using this stage, this platform, to stoke division, to incite violence. You are the one spreading lies." His words shot through the air like bullets, fast and sharp. His usual calculated cadence was replaced with raw emotion, the frustration of someone who could feel control slipping away. The studio, once full of a tense but managed quiet, now buzzed with his outrage. The audience shifted, uncertain whether to react with applause or jeers, their eyes flickering between Shapiro's sudden outburst and Jasmine, who hadn't moved an inch. But Crockett? She stayed calm. Her eyes never left his. Her posture didn't change. She didn't stand up, didn't lean forward, didn't match his intensity with her own. Instead, she remained seated, her hands folded in front of her, her breathing slow and even. It was the stillness that struck hardest, the calm before a storm that had already passed. She exhaled once, just enough for the words to form, but not so loudly that anyone could mistake them for a reaction. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "The truth doesn't need to shout, Ben." She let the words hang in the air, deliberate and final. "It just needs to be illuminated." The tension in the room thickened, every eye now on her, not with expectation, but with a quiet understanding. They had heard the man. They had seen his anger, his distortion, and now here was the response. Not a defense, but a simple unveiling. The weight of Crockett's words was enough to press down on the atmosphere, to weigh it with the quiet strength that only someone truly unshaken can possess. For a moment, everything paused. Even Shapiro seemed to freeze, his chest still rising and falling with shallow breaths. But it wasn't just him. The entire room had shifted. The energy had changed. No longer was it about who could shout the loudest or wield the most fiery rhetoric. It was about something more uncomfortable: accountability, the harsh, bright light of truth that would not be hidden. And then, without warning, it happened. The audience, once divided, stood in unison. But it wasn't in celebration, it wasn't in applause. They stood in silence, still quiet, a unified moment of acknowledgement. The room didn't fill with clapping or cheering. It filled with something deeper, something more meaningful. They stood not because of the words that had been spoken, but because of the gravity with which they had been delivered. Crockett wasn't just speaking to Shapiro. She was speaking to them. She was speaking to the millions who watched, to the unseen viewers who lived and breathed in silence while their truth was twisted or erased. No one moved, no one cheered. But the collective acknowledgement hung in the air like a palpable weight, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't just a moment of victory, it was a shift. A moment where the truth had been spoken so plainly, so simply, that the only possible response was silence, reverence, and recognition. Crockett sat, unmoving, as the room around her trembled, not from the chaos of conflict, but from the quiet storm of a truth that no one could escape. She had said what needed to be said, not to win, but to show that truth is not a weapon. It's a shield. And in that moment, it had protected her. The camera zoomed in on her face, not for the drama of the moment, but because the camera knew something had changed. The angle shifted, and for a brief second, the light caught her eyes. Steady, unwavering, like a beacon in a storm that refused to let anyone else decide what it was supposed to look like. The moderator, who had sat frozen during the last exchange, now cleared her throat awkwardly, her voice hesitant, but powerful in its own way. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her words coming slower now, measured as if she, too, had been hit with the weight of what had just transpired. "You are witnessing history unfold, a confrontation not just between two people, but between two realities." Shapiro, still standing, his face flushed with frustration, opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His chest rose and fell, but the words he had always been so quick to deliver, those sharp, premeditated insults, the calculated hits, had evaporated. For the first time that night, he was speechless, not because he lacked a rebuttal, but because the truth had spoken louder than his carefully constructed narrative. Crockett didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her gaze was on the moment, not on the man, not on the audience, but on the weight of everything that had just transpired. She knew the truth was out there now, and it would never again be silenced. As the camera lights dimmed and the studio began to clear, the echoes of the debate didn't fade. They reverberated, swelling across the internet, where the truth had finally found its own voice, louder than any edited clip, louder than any distortion. Within hours of the live broadcast, social media was a storm, an avalanche of tweets, reposts, and trending hashtags. The screens of millions of phones lit up across the country, flashing words that had once been reserved for obscure blogs and whisper campaigns. Truth over tactics and Crockett debate victory skyrocketed to #1 on Twitter, dominating every news feed, every trending topic. The hashtags weren't just responses, they were declarations. They were the new rallying cry of people tired of seeing their voices twisted and sold for profit. The discussion spiraled beyond just political lines. It became a movement, a collective reckoning that had been building for years. Users from every corner of the political spectrum weighed in. Some criticized, others cheered. But one thing was clear. Crockett's words had ignited something in the collective consciousness. Her calm had been the fire starter. On television screens, on computers, and across every social media platform, people who had once felt unheard, overlooked, and silenced found a voice in that moment. They saw themselves in her, unapologetically standing up, unwavering in the face of manipulation, demanding the truth be heard. And with every retweet, with every new post, the truth expanded. It wasn't just her victory, it was theirs too. The truth that had been hidden in plain sight had now come to light. It had been cut, edited, and distorted, but it was now raw and undeniable. As the digital world erupted in response, Jasmine Crockett sat in the empty studio, the tension of the evening finally starting to unwind in her chest. She wasn't smiling. There was no relief on her face, only the quiet, hard-won recognition that she had done what she came to do. She had stood up not to win the argument, but to stop losing, to stop letting the truth be buried beneath lies and distractions. The weight of the night, of all the battles fought in silence before this moment, was heavy, but there was a sense of satisfaction in it. She had broken through, and the truth had broken through with her. As the lights in the studio began to dim, the camera caught one last image of Crockett, her face calm, resolute. The stage was empty now, the energy dissipating into the dark. But there was something more lasting in the quiet, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the air, as if the world had just exhaled. This wasn't just a political victory. It was a victory for transparency, for accountability, for every person who had ever felt their voice was too small to matter. The camera angle pulled back, the vast expanse of the now empty studio looming behind her. In the corner of the screen, an iconic message flickered into view. The words, simple yet powerful, appeared in bold letters, hanging in the silence of the moment. In a world full of edited truths, be the raw footage. The message lingered, suspended in time, as the stage lights finally faded to black, leaving the screen in darkness. But the final words still echoed. The words weren't just a slogan, they were a challenge. A challenge to all who had been silenced, to all who had been ignored, to anyone who had ever been told their voice wasn't loud enough. It wasn't just about the fight Jasmine had won that night. It was about the larger fight she had reignited, the fight for transparency, the fight for truth. And as the darkness took over the screen, the message remained. The world for a moment stood still. But even as the lights dimmed and the world moved on, the echoes of that final message reverberated far beyond the studio, echoing in the hearts of those who had been waiting for their moment to speak, for their truth to finally be seen. The next morning, the world woke up to something that felt different. The political landscape, with its usual din of talking points and headline-chasing sound bites, was momentarily silenced by the aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's victory. News outlets, once comfortable with their partisan ruts, found themselves grappling with an undeniable shift in public sentiment. The truth comes to light. Crockett's victory over media manipulation screamed the front page of the New York Times. Congresswoman Crockett takes on Shapiro, and the truth wins, flashed in bold print across the Washington Post. Even cable networks, which thrived on sensationalism, found themselves cornered by a story that transcended party lines. It wasn't just about Crockett and Shapiro anymore. It was about something larger, a reckoning for a media culture that had long twisted facts to fit its narrative. Across social media, the hashtags were relentless. Truth over tactics and Crockett debate victory didn't fade into the abyss after the initial burst of excitement. They lingered, gaining momentum, snowballing into a movement that reached far beyond the initial debate. People who had once been quiet, unsure if their voices mattered, began to speak out. Truth over tactics became more than a rallying cry for political wonks. It became a manifesto for those who had been silenced, ignored, and marginalized. It was a cry for transparency in a world where it often felt like truth was buried under layers of misdirection. Jasmine Crockett had not simply won a debate, she had sparked something new. Something that was less about winning an argument and more about awakening an entire nation to the idea that the truth had been compromised, manipulated, and obscured for far too long. For weeks, the airwaves buzzed with discussions about the implications of her words. Her calm, her resolve, her absolute refusal to back down. These things resonated, and the echo of that truth reverberated across the political divide. For every attack, there was a counterattack from those who recognized the significance of what had just happened. Even the media outlets that had initially tried to dismiss Crockett's message began to shift. The same talking heads who had scoffed at her a few weeks prior now found themselves grappling with the uncomfortable reality that they had been complicit in perpetuating narratives that were not only false but damaging. The people who had ridiculed her as just another politician with a loud voice began to reconsider. Because in that one decisive moment, Jasmine had revealed something about them, not just about her. She had shown that the very institutions that claimed to protect truth were, in fact, the ones distorting it. She had exposed the machinery of manipulation that had been churning behind the scenes for so long. Across the nation, ordinary people found themselves waking up to a new kind of activism, the kind that didn't require sensational headlines or viral moments, but was rooted in a deep, unshakable commitment to the truth. This wasn't about political parties. This wasn't about media networks. This was about something more fundamental, an urgent, collective recognition that truth had been buried, and it was time to uncover it. As Crockett walked through the halls of Congress in the following weeks, she was met not with the usual disdain that often accompanies political figures in contentious environments, but with quiet nods of respect. Not from her colleagues in the usual sense, but from the people, ordinary citizens who stopped her in the hallway, who shook her hand and said, "You gave us a voice." Those words weighed more than any victory she could have claimed in the debate. They reminded her that what had happened wasn't just a political win, it was a moral one. In the quiet moments as her phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support, Crockett reflected on what had truly transpired that night. It wasn't just about exposing Shapiro for his hypocrisy or about the victory she had claimed in that moment. It was about what that moment represented, a shift, a moment where the veil of distortion had been lifted, and the people, regardless of their political affiliation, were invited to see the truth for what it was. Her words had been simple, measured, but potent. The truth doesn't need to shout, Ben. It just needs to be illuminated. And illuminated it was. It wasn't just a debate, not anymore. It was a turning point, a moment when the world finally recognized that the truth, when stripped of its manipulation, could stand stronger than any narrative. The battle had not been fought in the words they exchanged. It had been fought in the silence that followed. In the silence, the truth stood unwavering, immune to the noise of distractions. In the aftermath, Crockett was inundated with support from every corner. Political allies, civil rights activists, and even everyday citizens began sharing their own stories. They spoke of the times they had been silenced, by the media, by powerful interests, or by society's indifference. Truth over tactics became a voice for the voiceless. It became a cry for transparency, for accountability, for a new kind of leadership. And as the movement grew, it became clear that the battle was far from over. But Jasmine didn't bask in the attention. She didn't seek accolades. She understood that the victory wasn't about her. It was about the truth being heard. She had played her part, and now the people had to play theirs. This wasn't a moment of triumph. It was the beginning of a deeper, more sustained fight. It wasn't about winning one debate. It was about ensuring that the truth could no longer be buried by those who profit from deception. As the lights in the studio dimmed, signaling the end of another chapter, Crockett stood for a brief moment, allowing the gravity of everything to settle. The world had seen her. The world had heard her. And now it was time for the world to act. The final image lingered on the screen for just a beat longer than usual. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a challenge a challenge to everyone watching, to everyone who had ever been forced to speak louder to be heard. The words appeared in stark, simple text. In a world full of edited truth, be the raw footage. The lights finally flickered to black. The camera faded and the stage fell silent. And in that silence, something shifted. Not because of one debate, but because of the power of one truth, unapologetically spoken. And as the lights dimmed and the world watched in stunned silence, the true weight of Jasmine Crockett's journey began to unfold. Not in the applause, but in the deeper understanding of what had been exposed that night. The story of Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a victory in the typical sense. It was a lesson about the kind of courage that doesn't shout to be heard, but demands space to exist. In a world where voices are constantly manipulated, drowned out by the noise of powerful forces, Crockett's steadfastness became a beacon, not because of the debate she won, but because of the fight she waged in silence. The truth she revealed was one that couldn't be drowned by the noise of a single debate or the manipulation of media. It was a truth that had been buried, ignored, and distorted. But in that moment, it was brought into the light for everyone to see. What made her journey different from so many others who had faced the same battle was her ability to see through the fog of distraction and deception, to step forward not with the intent of victory, but with the intent to simply be seen. The injustice that had been perpetrated against her wasn't just the misrepresentation of her words or the accusations of rage and division. The real injustice lay in the system that allowed that distortion to happen over and over again. It was a system that catered to the powerful, the wealthy, the loud. A system that bent to the will of those who had access to the microphone, the platform, and the spotlight. But Crockett, in her quiet defiance, took that system head-on. She didn't just fight for her own voice. She fought for the millions of people whose voices had been silenced by the very machinery she exposed. The injustice she faced wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It was the weight of decades of media manipulation, the subtle but insidious ways that truth had been replaced with sensationalism, the constant pushing of narratives that served the powerful while ignoring the needs of the people. The people who had been marginalized, misunderstood, and ignored for so long were finally given a voice, not by shouting louder than the others, but by standing firm, unshaken, and unwavering in their commitment to truth. And so, as the world watched the fallout of that debate, the viral hashtags, the articles, the reactions, what became clear was not that Crockett had simply defeated Ben Shapiro in a debate. What became clear was that she had taken the first step in a much larger battle. She had opened the door to a conversation that had been closed for too long, and in doing so, she had shown the world the true power of speaking truth in the face of overwhelming opposition. The lesson here, however, went beyond politics, beyond rhetoric. It was about standing in the face of injustice and saying, "This cannot stand." It was about confronting the systems that benefit from misinformation and manipulation and daring to ask for accountability. Crockett showed that the real battle wasn't about winning a debate. It was about exposing the forces that work tirelessly to keep people in the dark, to keep them unaware, to keep them silent. And the power in that moment was not in the loudest voice, but in the quiet, unshakable stance of one person who refused to be silenced. Her words, though calm, resonated with an intensity that couldn't be ignored. "I don't want applause," she had said, and in that moment, she had revealed the heart of the issue. "I want awareness." She wasn't asking for the world to cheer her on. She wasn't asking for praise. She was asking for something far more profound. She was asking for the truth to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be seen. It was a stark reminder that we live in a world where the loudest voices are not always the ones telling the truth. In fact, the loudest voices are often the ones most invested in bearing it. Those who have the power to amplify their message are not always the ones who speak for justice. They are often the ones who use their power to keep the truth hidden. But Crockett's moment, her stand, shattered that illusion. The lesson was clear. Truth is not something that is handed down from the powerful. It is something that is claimed by those who are willing to stand, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, and say, "This is what matters." Her journey wasn't just a fight against one man or one moment. It was a battle against a system that had long relied on manipulation to maintain its hold. She didn't just expose Ben Shapiro. She exposed the way the media and the political system had been complicit in creating a world where truth was optional, where facts were shaped to fit an agenda. In doing so, she sparked a wider conversation about accountability, transparency, and the moral imperative to hold those in power to the truth. And this was the true lesson of her story. It was a lesson about the importance of truth in a world that often seeks to suppress it. It was about the moral courage required to stand in that gap, to confront injustice directly, and to insist that no matter how loud the distortion becomes, the truth will always find a way to be heard. Crockett's stand was not about the glory of being right. It was about the responsibility of ensuring that the truth is never lost. The world had witnessed the unmasking of a system that had been hiding in plain sight. And in doing so, Crockett had shown the world that the fight for truth is not over. It is ongoing. It is relentless. But in the end, the truth will always find a way to shine through. The light of that truth cannot be extinguished by manipulation or deceit. And as Crockett's words echoed in the hearts and minds of millions, they became the catalyst for change, a shift that would continue to build, quietly but powerfully, in the hearts of those who understood the importance of standing for what is right. Because at the end of it all, what Jasmine Crockett proved was this: when the world tries to bury the truth, you don't need to shout louder. You simply need to be the truth, raw, unfiltered, and unapologetic. And in doing so, you become the beacon that guides others to speak their own truth, to stand tall, and to demand the justice that has long been denied. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a high-stakes showdown on Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett confronts Joe Manchin, exposing deep corruption hidden behind political power. As the truth unravels, Crockett reveals shocking ties to millions of dollars in undisclosed deals with fossil fuel giants, threatening the very foundation of Manchin's career. With the clock ticking, emotions run high as each side battles for control, one seeking justice, the other fighting to protect decades of power. As the investigation looms, will Crockett succeed in holding Manchin accountable for his conflicts of interest, or will the system protect him once again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the harsh white lights of room 226 on Capitol Hill, the chamber filled slowly, buzzing with tension that clung to the air like static before a storm. Reporters lined the back wall, fingers poised over keyboards. Cameras blinked red, ready to broadcast every breath. The hearing's title glowed on the front monitor: The Hidden Cost, Personal Interests in National Energy Policy. Chairman Halloran adjusted his microphone with a slow, deliberate hand. "Let the record show," he began. "This session of the Oversight Committee is now in order." The room hushed. He leaned forward. "Today we examine whether private profit has steered public policy. Our witness, former Senate Energy Chair, Senator Joseph Manchin." At the sound of that name, the temperature seemed to drop. The double doors creaked open, and Joe Manchin entered, with the ease of a man who had walked these halls longer than some members had been alive. His suit was a pristine charcoal gray, his tie the color of dried blood. He moved like a heavyweight entering the ring, not with brute force, but with the calm swagger of practiced dominance. At the witness table, he paused, offered a half smile, and let his eyes drift confidently across the panel. "I'm here today not to play party games," he said smoothly, "but to speak the truth, no matter how inconvenient." A few members nodded, not all. At the far right side of the U-shaped desk, barely within the C-SPAN frame, sat Representative Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, just kept writing. The chair recognized Manchin with formal courtesy, but eyes were already beginning to flicker down the row, toward the woman in the sharp navy blazer with a single silver Texas pin on her lapel. Jasmine Crockett was new, young, bold, some whispered, and she had been seated at the far end not by oversight, but by tradition. Seniority had its pecking order. Still, she sat with her back straight, elbows tucked, fingers stained from morning research. She wasn't a rookie. She was a fuse waiting for spark. Every word Manchin uttered, she marked, not out of fear, not out of awe, but with the clinical precision of someone waiting for the perfect opening to strike. As Manchin began to recount his record, citing legislation passed, coal jobs preserved, and rural communities defended, the camera slowly zoomed in on his face. He gestured with the gravitas of an elder statesman, weaving the narrative like a man who'd told this story 1,000 times. Over the course of my public service, I've stood where it counts. On the side of working families, not political fads. I've authored legislation that saved thousands of coal jobs, protected rural livelihoods, and kept this country from becoming dependent on foreign energy. We talk about clean energy, and sure, we all want a better future, but not at the expense of West Virginia families. Not by bulldozing our economy to satisfy some academic fantasy cooked up in coastal boardrooms. Energy independence isn't a slogan to me. It's personal, it's survival. And if folks want to lecture me about values, let me tell you something. West Virginia values are not up for negotiation. He paused, then added with a tighter smile. I didn't come here to argue with hashtags or to entertain ideological extremes. I came to speak truth, grounded in experience. And if that truth makes people uncomfortable, maybe it should. No one interrupted. Not yet. But something had shifted. The energy in the room had grown taut. Committee members glanced between one another, uncertain whether this hearing would unravel into another ceremonial dance, or something far more volatile. Chairman Halloran cleared his throat. Thank you, Senator Manchin, for your opening statement, he said carefully. We will now proceed with member questions in order of seniority. The names began to roll, one by one. Crockett remained silent. She was last, by design. Because sometimes the most devastating blow isn't the first, it's the one no one sees coming until the room is already on fire. But as the cameras reset and the first round of questioning began, it became clear that Manchin wasn't just there to testify. He was there to defend a legacy built on fossil fuel and finesse. The early questions came with diplomatic phrasing, dressed in the language of respect. But when Representative Bellerose asked about the Mountain Valley Pipeline, the temperature changed. Her tone was sharper, more surgical. Senator Manchin, could you clarify your continued support for the Mountain Valley Pipeline? Many critics argue the project threatens Appalachian ecosystems and tribal lands. What makes this necessary now, in 2025? Manchin didn't hesitate. His voice was steady, seasoned, and polished to a shine. The Mountain Valley Pipeline is critical to national energy security, he began, letting each word drop like a statement of record. We need redundancy, we need resilience, and we need jobs in communities that have been ignored for decades. This isn't just about gas, it's about sovereignty. He leaned back, hands folded, as if the answer was so obvious it required no follow-up. In his mind, this wasn't debate, it was doctrine. From the far end of the dais, Jasmine Crockett watched him, not with hostility, but with something colder, comprehension. She'd seen this before, how power disguised itself as patriotism, how profit hid behind phrases like forgotten communities. Then came a second question, this time from a congressman seated left of center. Senator, could you explain your current relationship with Enersystems, the coal firm founded by your family? The pause before Manchin's response was less than a second, but enough for those who knew what to look for. He straightened, adjusted his sleeve. I haven't had an operational role in Enersystems for years, he replied evenly. I stepped away. I don't run it. I don't make its decisions. His delivery was practiced, carefully legalistic, designed to sound like distance, while offering no true separation. Then with a quick breath, he added, my shares are in a blind trust. My only focus is the American people. It was a clean answer, too clean, and it left a film in the air, something unseen but unmistakable. Crockett didn't speak. She didn't even shift in her seat. But in that moment, she stopped listening like a committee member and started listening like a prosecutor. But the room didn't stay quiet for long, because when silence falls around a lie, truth doesn't knock. It cuts. It started with a blink, just one red light beneath a dusty microphone, subtle, almost invisible, except to the chairman, who looked up with the slight hesitation of a man caught between routine and revelation. "Representative Crockett, you're recognized," he said, voice cautious, as if sensing the tremor before the quake. She didn't rush. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her seat by half an inch, placed her hands deliberately on the table, and leaned into the microphone with the stillness of someone who already knew the answer to the question she was about to ask. "Then why do you still receive over $500,000 in dividends from it each year?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried with force, measured, clean, and surgical. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't lean back for effect. She simply delivered the line like evidence entered into record. The words slid across the room like a switchblade across silk. And then, nothing. Not a breath, not a shuffle. The silence was total, but not empty. It was packed with weight, shock, awareness, and something else no one wanted to name: fear. Joe Manchin didn't flinch right away, but his smile faltered. Not enough to be obvious, but enough for the trained eyes in the room to catch. His hands, once gently steepled on the desk, tensed. A vein surfaced in his temple. His response didn't come immediately, because for the first time in that room, he wasn't in control of the pacing. The question hadn't been rhetorical. It hadn't been theatrical. It had been precise, and it came from someone everyone had underestimated. At the media platform in the back, a C-SPAN producer silently gestured to camera 2. The operator pivoted the lens away from the polished center and toward the far right corner of the dais. Slowly, dramatically, the feed reframed itself. Not on Manchin, the seasoned statesman, but on the woman in the navy blazer with ink-stained fingers and eyes like a locked safe. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, didn't blink. She didn't need to. The room was already rotating toward her, mentally, visually, emotionally. And in that frozen moment, her stillness said more than any outburst ever could. This wasn't a soundbite. It was a warning shot. The committee staff exchanged glances. The press corps sat forward in their seats. And somewhere outside, in homes and offices across America, viewers paused mid-scroll, because they knew, without needing context, that something real had just cracked through the noise. She hadn't called him a liar. She hadn't accused him of corruption. She had simply said, "Explain it," with numbers, with truth, with no place left to hide. And suddenly, the burden of proof was no longer hers. The silence after her question was deafening. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come for silence. She came with proof. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. While Manchin tried to collect himself in the echo of her question, Jasmine reached under the table with the slow precision of a surgeon pulling a scalpel from its sheath. From a matte black folder, she drew a neatly clipped document, worn at the corners, but meticulously organized, and laid it on the desk with deliberate care. Her fingertips lingered on the cover, just long enough for the C-SPAN cameras to catch the gold-stamped title, Office of Congressional Ethics, Public Financial Disclosure Reports. She didn't look at Manchin. She didn't need to. Her eyes were already on the clerk. "With permission, Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice steady but edged with something heavier now: finality. Halloran nodded. The clerk retrieved the file, and within seconds, the central display screen above the witness table flickered to life. What appeared wasn't sensational. It was sterile, cold, government-issued truth, devoid of spin or commentary. A decade of dividend income from Enersystems, mapped by year. One by one, the numbers lit up, each a digit that could not be denied. $491,000 in 2015, $508,000 in 2018, $536,000 in 2018-2020, $552,000 in 2022. Each bar rose higher, a column of quiet indictment against the man now staring at them in real time. There was no dramatic music, no shouting, no pounding of fists. But the air in room 226 changed. It thickened, it darkened. The oxygen seemed to pull itself out of the walls. Manchin didn't move, but his jawline hardened and his fingers tensed. Subtle tells in a man trained to never show discomfort in public. He knew the numbers, but seeing them stacked on a federal screen, before peers, before the press, before the nation, that was a different kind of exposure. Crockett stood, not rushed, not showy, just upright, like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to confirm. She walked slowly to the screen, the only sound in the room the click of her heels on tile and the faint hum of fluorescent light. When she reached the edge of the display, she extended her arm and pointed at the red spike labeled 2022-$552,000. Her hand held there steady, fingers splayed like a highlighter underlining a sentence no one wanted read aloud. Then she said it. And you opposed every single clean energy bill introduced during this period. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was calm, deliberate, unshakable. The room heard every word, not because of volume, but because there was nowhere to run from them. In that moment, the screen wasn't just data, it was a mirror, and the image it reflected was one of power built not on public trust, but on private return. No one spoke. The silence wasn't out of respect, it was out of realization. Every person in that room, whether ally or opponent, now had to ask themselves the same question. Was it policy or payment? Crockett lowered her hand but didn't turn away. Her eyes remained on the screen, as if to say, we're not done. And for the first time, the nation realized, neither was she. The data was undeniable. But when numbers threaten the throne, denial becomes the final line of defense, and Manchin wasn't ready to fall without a fight. For a long moment, he said nothing. His lips parted, but no sound came. He looked at the screen again. 10 years of cold, damning arithmetic glowing in front of him like a courtroom verdict etched in pixels. Then slowly Manchin sat forward, placing both hands on the table as if anchoring himself to the moment. His voice, when it finally emerged, was slower than before, tinged with forced calm, but every syllable carried the weight of a man slipping from control. That's coincidental, he said. I do what's best for my state. The words hung in the air like smoke over a fire already lit. He didn't elaborate. He didn't deny the money. He didn't refute the timeline. He just wrapped it all in a phrase that sounded like duty, but smelled like evasion. Instantly, the temperature in the room shifted. It wasn't shock anymore. It was disbelief. A ripple moved across the chamber, subtle but electric. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Reporters glanced up from their screens. Even Chairman Halloran furrowed his brow, the tip of his pen freezing above a notepad. Somewhere in the gallery, a low murmur broke out. A breath, a whisper, a warning. And then the sound grew, a rising tide of murmurs and disbelief, the kind that lives in spaces where the truth has just been challenged by a lie too thin to stand. But Crockett didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply turned her head slightly, just enough to study him. Really study him. Not like an adversary, but like a man unmasked. The silence she held now wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. Because in a room where every eye was suddenly watching, she didn't have to prove anything. He had just done it for her. But Crockett wasn't finished. Numbers were only the beginning. Now it was time to pull back the curtain on who had been feeding them. She reached into the folder again, her movements slow but sure, like someone unlocking the second chamber of a loaded weapon. What she pulled out next wasn't flashy, no bold graphics, no color-coded tabs. Just a thick packet of federal records, printed on plain white paper but heavy with implication. Across the top, Federal Election Commission, public contributions, energy sector, 2019 to 2024. The words alone told a story, but Crockett wasn't interested in stories. She was interested in names, amounts, and connections the public had never seen mapped together, until now. She handed the packet to the clerk, who, now visibly more alert, walked it to the screen system like it might explode. When the image appeared above the chamber, the room drew a collective breath. Unlike the financial disclosure charts, this one was messier. Lines and logos, donation arrows, amounts trailing like roots. But its message was crystal clear. Over $6 million in political contributions to Senator Manchin from companies directly tied to fossil fuel infrastructure, and more specifically, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Crockett didn't dramatize the moment. She didn't pace or posture. She stepped forward once, folded her hands lightly in front of her, and began to read, not hurriedly, but with the gravity of someone delivering a public record. not a personal opinion. Dominion Energy, Next Era, EQT Corporation, TransCanada, Kinder Morgan, BlackRock Energy. She paused after each name, letting them land, each one its own thunderclap. With every company uttered, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Not speculation, not theory, but undeniable links between private power and public policy. Manchin, who had sat still through the financial disclosures, now shifted. He tugged at his tie, not because it had moved, but because the pressure had. His fingers tapped twice on the desk, his brow furrowed not with anger, but with calculation. He could feel the eyes on him, not just the committee, but the gallery, the press, the viewers watching this unfold on live streams, phones, TV sets. He leaned forward finally, his voice lower than before, but noticeably sharper, laced with restrained indignation. "You're making this personal," he said. "This is a character attack." For the first time in the hearing, there was a ripple, not just in sound, but in trust. Some members glanced up, others leaned back. The line had been drawn, but Crockett didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. Her response came like a blade, not wide, not wild, but surgically clean. "I'm questioning your qualifications to represent a nation," she said, each word sharpened by truth. "Not the balance in your wallet." There was no rebuttal, no noise, just impact. Her tone didn't ask for agreement. It demanded accountability. And suddenly, what had begun as just another hearing had turned into something else entirely. A reckoning, not just of numbers, but of motive. But when facts cornered him and the room shifted, Manchin didn't offer more evidence. He reached for an old weapon: condescension. He adjusted his chair with a quick jerk, elbows pressing harder against the table as if anchoring himself for a different kind of fight. The warmth he once used to charm the room had vanished. Now his voice sharpened, not with insight, but with indignation disguised as authority. "You come from Texas, Congresswoman," he said slowly, each syllable coated in the quiet venom of dismissal. "You don't know a damn thing about mountain economies." The insult wasn't accidental. It was engineered, to draw a line between them, between his kind of politician and hers, between the coal-covered hills of West Virginia and the oil fields and urban centers of Texas. It was the sound of an empire protecting itself, not with answers, but with hierarchy. Before anyone could react, he added with a slight tilt of the head, like a man delivering a final blow, "You're short-sighted in a long game, the kind of politics that trends on Twitter but disappears by Tuesday." The line was delivered smoothly, almost rehearsed, weaponized condescension dressed up as seniority. But the impact was unmistakable. Several committee members blinked. A few lips tightened. One aide's pen stilled in midair. The insult didn't just question Crockett's knowledge. It questioned her right to even be in the room. And yet she didn't flinch. No angry rebuttal, no theatrics. Just a silence that unsettled. Because in that stillness, Crockett was drawing breath not to react, but to strike. She smiled. Not the kind of smile that comes from amusement, but from recognition, from experience, from hearing that same tone in too many rooms, from too many men who believed their seat was birthright and hers was borrowed. Her chin rose slightly, enough for the gallery and cameras to catch the shift. The confidence didn't scream, it radiated. Then she leaned in, barely but with purpose. Her voice, calm and unwavering, landed like a scalpel cutting through layers of posturing and political noise. "The reason I can ask the question your people have been afraid to ask for decades," she said, "is because I don't take money from coal." No one moved. No one breathed. Because in those 21 words, she didn't just answer an insult. She reversed the room. She took every dollar tied to his name, every evasion wrapped in hometown pride, every deflection he had rehearsed for years, and she handed it all back to him, piece by piece, in front of the nation. She wasn't speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for the silenced. But Crockett wasn't done drawing lines. Now she was about to draw blood. Because corruption isn't always measured in votes or dollars. Sometimes it's measured in lives lost quietly, in places where no camera had ever gone. She turned back to the folder. her tempo slow now, like an executioner choosing the final blade. The room had settled into a strange silence, taut and brittle, everyone aware something heavier was coming. Crockett lifted a new file, thinner than the rest, but heavier in implication. She didn't need to explain what it was. The word myelin in bold black letters said enough. The screen above flickered again. A simple image appeared. A closed gate, rusted chain, a sign that read Myelin Pharmaceuticals, permanently closed. Beneath it a caption, 1,400 jobs eliminated, Morgantown, West Virginia. No music, no commentary, just truth in its plainest form. She let the image breathe for a beat before she spoke. Her voice was softer now but heavier. "This is the plant that shut down in 2021, she said. "The one that used to produce life-saving medications. The one that fed over 1,000 families in West Virginia. The one that left behind silence, dead in pain when it vanished." The lights from the cameras reflected off her eyes, but they couldn't catch the sharpness buried in her tone. "And this," she added, tapping her finger against the screen, "was overseen by Mylan's CEO at the time, Heather Bresch. Senator Manchin's daughter murmurs broke through the walls again, but this time they weren't just about numbers. They were about betrayal. Because it's one thing to profit from industry. It's another to watch your own constituents fall into poverty while your family sits in executive suites." Crockett wasn't just unraveling policy now. She was unraveling legacy, and it showed in the way Manchin shifted his jaw, as if trying to find the exact place where pride ended and liability began. She clicked to the next slide. This time it was a video, grainy CSPAN footage from 2016. The playback rolled without warning. Manchin's voice filled the chamber. "My family has always stood with the working people of West Virginia." The clip ended. Abrupt, surgical, like a guillotine. She turned slowly toward Manchin, her expression unreadable, and asked the question she'd carried in silence long enough. "Who do you stand with now, Senator?" she said, eyes locked. "The unemployed workers your daughter left behind? Or the daughter in the corner office who signed the closure?" No noise followed. No one whispered. Because this wasn't drama anymore. This was exposure. The kind that couldn't be tweeted away or buried in PR statements. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him of a crime. She simply laid the facts side by side and asked the question his own voters had been asking for years, with no one brave enough to echo them into a microphone. Her words were a mirror, brutal, clean, reflective. And in that reflection, Manchin wasn't a senator. He was a father, a millionaire, a man whose name was stitched into the seams of decisions that cost people everything. Crockett stood still, the silence stretching longer than any in the room had heard that day. The screen behind her still showed the locked gates of the Mylan plant, and for a moment it felt less like Congress and more like a courtroom. No one reached for their water. No one cleared their throat, because the question lingered, not in the air, but in the gut. Manchin didn't speak. Couldn't, perhaps. Not yet, because there are moments when political armor fails. And this was one of them. Crockett hadn't attacked him. She had simply asked him to answer. And that, in this room, was far more dangerous. But Crockett hadn't just come to expose financial records or question moral alignment. She came with receipts in the rawest form, his own voice captured in a moment he never thought would reach the public. She took a long breath, giving the room just enough space to settle back into stillness before delivering the final blow. Then, reaching into the folder one last time, she held up a small, labeled flash drive. There was no folder this time, no paper trail, just a silver stick no bigger than a pen cap, but far more dangerous. "Mr. Chairman," she said calmly, "I request permission to play a short audio clip submitted to my office by a former senior policy advisor who worked under Senator Manchin." Halloran raised an eyebrow, glanced toward legal counsel, and hesitated for half a breath. But something in the atmosphere, the precision of Crockett's pacing, the tension that hadn't left the air in 20 minutes, pushed him forward. "Proceed," he said, voice low. The clerk plugged in the drive. There was a pause. Then the room filled with static, soft, distant at first, then sharper as the audio calibrated. A door closed, Papers rustled. Then came the voice, grainy, unmistakable, and unfiltered. Those damn climate activists, a bunch of obnoxious troublemakers. You cut off their money, they disappear. I'll make sure every one of their grants dries up before next budget cycle. Watch me. That was it. No music, no edits, no commentary, just Joseph Manchin's voice, raw and off script, saying exactly what he thought behind closed doors. There was no mistaking the cadence, the phrasing, the pride tucked behind contempt. He hadn't been arguing policy. He'd been targeting people, silencing opposition, not through debate, but through starvation. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. It pressed against the walls, filled the cracks between every desk, every glance, every breath. Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't need to, because in that moment, he had spoken enough for both of them. Manchin's jaw clenched visibly, his brow furrowing with a mix of recognition and fury. He didn't deny it. He didn't speak. But the stillness of his body, the way his shoulders squared slightly, betrayed everything the room needed to know. He remembered saying it, and now for the first time, he knew what it felt like to have his private arrogance dragged into public reckoning. The committee members sat frozen. A few stared straight ahead. Others dropped their eyes to their notes, unsure whether to look at him or at her. One congressman shook his head slowly, stunned. In the back, reporters had stopped typing. Their fingers hovered over keyboards as if words alone couldn't capture the moment. Chairman Halloran leaned forward, his fingers knit together, his lips tight. He exhaled hard through his nose. Given the sensitivity of what we've just heard, he said carefully, and the potential implications of this information, the committee will recess for 10 minutes. He tapped the gavel once, sharp, abrupt. The sound cracked through the room like a starting pistol, but no one moved. Crockett didn't sit. She remained standing, still and poised, her chin lifted, but her expression unreadable. Not triumphant, not smug, just resolved. This wasn't a moment of victory for her. It was a moment of clarity for everyone else. Because when people heard that tape, they didn't hear a senator. They heard the machinery of political retaliation. They heard what it meant when power stopped listening and started punishing. And they heard what activists, whistleblowers, and frontline communities had known for years. That too often the system doesn't break. It protects itself until someone forces it to look in the mirror. And Jasmine Crockett, standing alone under fluorescent lights with only a flash drive and a spine of steel, had just held that mirror up to its face. The gavel fell. The room stood still, but the damage had been done. In the 10-minute break, the world had shifted, and now the walls would begin to crack. When the gavel dropped, the tension in the room snapped like a stretched wire. The committee members scattered in different directions, some heading for the back, others huddling in quiet conversation. But Crockett stood motionless, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. She didn't need the break. She didn't need a moment to compose herself. She knew exactly what was at stake, and it wasn't just the room. It was the very foundation of the political game that had kept people like Manchin at the top for decades. But as the minutes ticked by, the energy in the room began to shift. Members who had been silent, who had been complacent, now found their voices. They couldn't ignore the stain of the recording any longer. They couldn't act as though it didn't matter. One by one, their gaze flickered back to Manchin, who remained seated, his shoulders tense, his face drawn. He was still trying to steady himself, but the walls were closing in on him, slowly, methodically, until there was no escape. It started with a low murmur. A congressman from Pennsylvania stood up first, the words coming with less certainty than before. "Senator," he began, his voice noticeably softer than before, "your comment on climate activists." His words trailed off, but the room was already listening more closely. Another member, this time from Ohio, followed suit. "Senator, in your statement about blocking funding for climate change initiatives, wasn't that an abuse of power? Weren't you using your position to punish opposition rather than legislate?" The questions were coming faster now, each one landing with more weight, less hesitation. But the loudest message came from a quiet, subtle action. A movement so small, yet so profound, it could have been missed by anyone not paying attention. The congressman from West Virginia, who had long been Manchin's ally, who had worn the stand with Joe Pin proudly, slowly, deliberately unbuttoned his jacket and removed the small badge from his lapel. The soft rustle of fabric was the only sound in the room as the pin dropped to his desk with a quiet finality. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a signal, a sign of retreat, of turning away. Crockett saw it. The other committee members saw it. And, for the first time in the hearing, the pressure was on Manchin to explain himself, not just to Crockett, but to the very people who had once propped him up. Crockett, still standing, her back straight like the pillar of resistance she had become, watched as the room's dynamics shifted. But she wasn't done yet. She had asked her questions, but now it was time for a statement, a moment that would crystallize everything she had said up until that point. As her words cut through the charged silence, she didn't look at Manchin. She looked straight ahead, her voice rising in strength, steady but full of conviction. We cannot fight for the people while wearing diamond rings gifted by the corporations they fear. The words hung in the air, sharp, cutting deeper than any question or accusation could. She wasn't just pointing to the money. She was pointing to the system that allowed men like Manchin to sit in their ivory towers, collect wealth from the very industries that harmed the people they were supposed to protect, and still claim to be the champion of the working class. She wasn't just attacking a man. She was attacking the unspoken power structure that allowed him to thrive while people like her, people like his constituents, struggled to make ends meet. Crockett's words were not just an accusation. They were a declaration. Her hands were steady, her eyes focused. She wasn't merely holding him accountable. She was exposing the hypocrisy at the heart of the system. The room remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. Manchin didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His silence was as telling as any word he could have said. His gaze shifted downward, then back up. But his face was now a mask, tighter, more strained. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being questioned. Not like this. Not by someone who wasn't afraid to strip back the layers of his carefully cultivated image. The weight of what she had said was undeniable. The room felt the truth of her statement settling in like a storm cloud overhead. No one knew what would come next, but they all knew that something had changed. And for a moment, the whole political theater of it all seemed to disappear. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about party lines. It was about something much more fundamental. Who had the power to speak truth, and who was left silenced by their own corruption? Crockett's smile was small, not out of malice, but out of resolve. She didn't need to say more. The question had been asked. The line had been drawn. The room had felt the weight of her words. But Crockett wasn't done yet. Now she was about to expose not just the man before her, but the very system that allowed him to thrive. Crockett didn't move immediately. She let the moment breathe, letting the weight of her previous statement settle in the air like smoke after a blast. The room remained deathly still. No shifting in seats, no murmurs, just the sound of the room's collective heartbeat pounding in her ears. All eyes were on her now. The battle lines had been drawn, and she wasn't about to let them fade with the silence. She stood tall, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that no one could ignore. She picked up the folder with her notes, not as a crutch, but as a weapon. Her words now backed by the unassailable evidence she had just laid out. And then she spoke again. But this time, she didn't just ask questions. She delivered a judgment, one that would echo in the chamber for the rest of the day. We cannot talk about climate justice, she began, her voice cutting through the thick silence, when lawmakers are fed by the blood of coal. Her words landed, a direct hit. Manchin stiffened at the mention of coal, his lifeblood, his foundation. Crockett didn't shy away. She had watched families suffer under the false promises of men like him. She had seen the long lines at food banks, the schools closing, the hope that was slowly being choked by the very industries they were supposed to regulate. Her words were not just an accusation. They were a mirror. And the reflection it showed was one that Manchin, for all his political acumen, could not escape. The committee members didn't dare breathe. The air itself felt like it had thickened. They could feel the enormity of the moment, the weight of the truth Crockett had just unleashed. Manchin's face tightened, but he didn't respond. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes flickered nervously, betraying the facade he had maintained for so long. "And let me be clear," Crockett continued, her voice firm now, as if the very foundations of her statement had been set. "My party is not a refuge for those who sell their morals to keep their seat." She wasn't talking just about Manchin anymore. She was talking about the system, about a political machine that allowed men like him to profit off of public trust, about a party that, for too long, had turned a blind eye to corruption in the name of unity. Her words were not just a confrontation. They were a call to action. She wasn't just demanding accountability from Manchin. She was demanding it from every person in that room and every person watching from the outside. The room shifted again. It wasn't just Manchin that had been exposed. It was the entire framework of political expediency that had allowed the status quo to thrive. Crockett wasn't asking for reform. She was calling for a revolution of conscience. She wasn't here for polite discussions. She was here for truth. And then, as the tension reached its peak, the camera zoomed in on Manchin, capturing the shift in his demeanor. For the first time, his face fell. No more practiced poise, no more political mask. There was only the reality of what he had been caught in. The weight of the exposure pressed down on him, forcing his gaze to drop. For a moment, he was no longer the man in control. He was the man being questioned, scrutinized under the unforgiving light of public accountability. The cameras captured it all, the moment where his carefully crafted persona began to crack. His shoulders slumped, his eyes flickered to the side, as if searching for an exit. But there was none. No more words, no more deflections. He had been laid bare. Crockett stood, unmoving, not triumphant, but resolute. She had spoken truth. And in that moment, it wasn't just her voice that carried it. It was the collective voice of every person who had ever been silenced by power, by money, by influence. The room was still, but the silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Manchin had nowhere to hide. The hearing ended, but the impact did not. Truth once spoken in a room built to contain it had leaked out, into headlines, into living rooms, into history. As the gavel dropped for the final time, the hush that had gripped room 226 didn't vanish. It simply migrated. First into whispers, then into phone screens, then into a firestorm. By the time the committee doors swung open and the members filtered out into the marbled corridors of Capitol Hill, the hashtag Crockett and Manchin had already ignited across the nation. It didn't just trend. It exploded. Within hours, it climbed to the top of Twitter's national list, then global. Cable news anchors replayed Jasmine Crockett's final words in a loop, analysts breaking down each sentence like political scripture. On TikTok, young climate organizers stitched together clips of her cross-examination with protest footage from West Virginia, calling her the voice we've been waiting for. Overnight, what had begun as a committee hearing became a cultural reckoning. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, the silence from Manchin's office was deafening. His team issued no statement, no rebuttal, no correction. Aides confirmed he had not left his Senate office since the hearing ended. Curtains were drawn. Staff moved like ghosts. Reporters staked out the hallway, waiting for a glimpse, a quote, anything. But for 48 hours, there was nothing. No comment, no denial, just the echo of his own voice, caught on tape, bouncing through a nation suddenly unwilling to forget. Then came the blow that broke through even that silence. On the afternoon of the second day, the Office of Congressional Ethics released a terse but explosive statement. Due to the serious nature of evidence presented during the May 12th hearing regarding financial conflict of interest, the OCE is formally opening an investigation into Senator Joseph Manchin. It wasn't a leak. It was official, and it changed everything. News alerts lit up phones nationwide. Pundits, who only 2 days earlier had dismissed the hearing as mostly performative, now scrambled to explain the legal implications of what had been uncovered. Suddenly, this wasn't just a scandal. It was a test of institutional integrity. What would the Senate do with a man whose political record had just been shadowed by personal enrichment and private vendettas? And in the middle of the storm, Jasmine Crockett walked calmly toward the press briefing room. She wore no celebration, no smugness, only focus. The walls were plastered with camera lights. Dozens of microphones leaned toward her like drawn weapons. The questions came fast, layered, urgent. Some shouted over others, each trying to frame the moment through their own lens. But one voice cut through the chaos. A reporter from a major political network, her tone more curious than accusatory, asked what many had been thinking since Crockett began her line of questioning. "Congresswoman Crockett, after what you've done here, are you afraid your party might move to expel you?" There was no delay, no glance to advisors, no hedging. Crockett stepped forward, eyes steady, voice firm enough to halt every breath in the room. Her answer was not rehearsed. It was lived. "If telling the truth is considered a crime," she said, each word measured like a verdict, "then maybe the fault doesn't lie with me. Maybe it lies with a system that's been silent for far too long." The silence afterward was profound. Not awkward, not performative. It was the kind of silence that follows revelation. That follows a line so honest it strips power down to its bones. The cameras zoomed in, not for drama, but because they had to. There was something undeniable in her expression. Not defiance, not pride. Something deeper, a kind of still-burning clarity only truth could produce. In that moment, Crockett didn't look like a member of Congress. She looked like something older, like justice that had finally found a voice. Across the country, her words flooded social media. Within minutes, quotes from her press conference were shared by climate activists, ethics watchdogs, and young progressive leaders. Major papers ran op-eds titled "What Crockett Said Out Loud" and "The Moral Line Has Been Drawn." Editorial boards that had once called for party unity began openly questioning why it took a freshman congresswoman to expose rot at the core of one of the Senate's longest-serving members. But the backlash came swiftly, too. From within her own party, whispers began. Senior Democrats, though silent in public, privately expressed discomfort. Some called her too aggressive. Others labeled her divisive. Behind closed doors, conversations turned to whether Crockett could be punished without appearing vindictive, if they could isolate her without martyring her. She knew, she felt it, that telling the truth in a system built on compromise comes at a cost. But Crockett also understood something most politicians forget. Some costs are worth paying. The next morning, she walked into her office as usual, head held high. On her desk, between stacks of memos and unopened letters, sat a single envelope with no return address. Inside was a note written in rough cursive. "I lost my job when Milan shut down. I didn't think anyone would ever say what you said. You didn't just speak for West Virginia. You spoke for people like me. Thank you." She read it once, then again. Then she folded it carefully, placed it inside her jacket pocket, and walked out the door. Because the next hearing was coming, and this time, everyone would be watching. The gavel fell, but the tremor didn't stop at the wood. It rippled outward, into newsrooms, across phones, into group chats, city halls, union offices, rural kitchens, classrooms, churches, and digital town squares. Jasmine Crockett had not merely questioned a senator. She had called out the very skeleton of power that had held for decades, and America felt it. By the time the hearing room emptied, the hashtag #sign Crockett versus Manchin had already ignited across the nation. It didn't just trend, it exploded. Within hours, it climbed to the top of Twitter's national list, then global. Cable news anchors replayed Jasmine Crockett's final words in a loop, analysts breaking down each sentence like political scripture. On TikTok, young climate organizers stitched together clips of her cross-examination with protest footage from West Virginia, calling her the voice we've been waiting for. Overnight, what had begun as a committee hearing became a cultural reckoning. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, the silence from Manchin's office was deafening. His team issued no statement, no rebuttal, no correction. Aides confirmed he had not left his Senate office since the hearing ended. Curtains were drawn. Staff moved like ghosts. Reporters staked out the hallway, waiting for a glimpse, a quote, anything. But for 48 hours, there was nothing. No comment, no denial, just the echo of his own voice, caught on tape, bouncing through a nation suddenly unwilling to forget. Then came the blow that broke through even that silence. On the afternoon of the second day, The Office of Congressional Ethics released a terse but explosive statement. Due to the serious nature of evidence presented during the May 12th hearing regarding financial conflict of interest, the OCE is formally opening an investigation into Senator Joseph Manchin. It wasn't a leak. It was official, and it changed everything. News alerts lit up phones nationwide. Pundits, who only 2 days earlier had dismissed the hearing as mostly performative, now scrambled to explain the legal implications of what had been uncovered. Suddenly, this wasn't just a scandal, it was a test of institutional integrity. What would the Senate do with a man whose political record had just been shadowed by personal enrichment and private vendettas? And in the middle of the storm, Jasmine Crockett walked calmly toward the press briefing room. She wore no celebration, no smugness, only focus. The walls were plastered with camera lights. Dozens of microphones leaned toward her like drawn weapons. The questions came fast, layered, urgent. Some shouted over others, each trying to frame the moment through their own lens. But one voice cut through the chaos. A reporter from a major political network, her tone more curious than accusatory, asked what many had been thinking since Crockett began her line of questioning. "Congresswoman Crockett, after what you've done here, are you afraid your party might move to expel you?" There was no delay, no glance to advisors, no hedging. Crockett stepped forward, eyes steady, voice firm enough to halt every breath in the room. Her answer was not rehearsed, it was lived. "If telling the truth is considered a crime," she said, each word measured like a verdict, "then maybe the fault doesn't lie with me. Maybe it lies with a system that's been silent for far too long." The silence afterward was profound, not awkward, not performative. It was the kind of silence that follows revelation, that follows a line so honest it strips power down to its bones. The cameras zoomed in, not for drama, but because they had to. There was something undeniable in her expression. Not defiance, not pride, something deeper. A kind of still-burning clarity only truth could produce. In that moment, Crockett didn't look like a member of Congress. She looked like something older, like justice that had finally found a voice. The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews, protests, and sleepless nights. Jasmine Crockett had opened a door that many in Washington had tried desperately to keep closed. But what followed wasn't just a political battle. It was the price of speaking the truth in a place that thrives on compromise and silence. As the days passed, it became clear. The world outside was rallying behind her. But inside the halls of power, the real fight was just beginning. At first, the reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. Grassroots activists flooded social media with messages of thanks. Young people, particularly from marginalized communities, saw Crockett not as a politician, but as a symbol of what could be achieved when someone dared to speak plainly, without fear of the consequences. "She said what we were all thinking," one activist wrote on Twitter. "She finally called them out. All of them." Her inbox was flooded with messages from coal miners in West Virginia, teachers in Alabama, and single mothers in rural America, all saying the same thing: "Thank you." But even as her platform grew, so did the pressure. Back in Washington, the whispers started, conversations behind closed doors. Some members of her own party, once allies, started distancing themselves. The establishment could feel the weight of her challenge and saw it not as a battle against injustice, but a threat to their carefully balanced power. Within 72 hours of her explosive statements, a small but vocal faction of senior Democrats began to voice concerns. Some feared the potential fallout. What would this mean for the next election cycle? Would her stance alienate moderates or fuel the right wing's attacks? They were already discussing whether they could isolate her without making her a martyr. At the same time, Republicans, who had once laughed off her radical agenda, began to sense the change in the air. They weren't laughing anymore. Jasmine Crockett knew the stakes. She wasn't naive enough to believe that challenging a figure like Joe Manchin, one of the most powerful senators in the country, would come without cost. In fact, she had anticipated the pushback. But nothing could have prepared her for the quiet pressure that began to seep in from all sides. It wasn't the public that was the problem. It was the system itself. The committee hearings resumed a week later, but the air had shifted. As Crockett sat in her chair, the tension was palpable. Several members, once friendly, now looked at her with a mix of hesitation and suspicion. She had broken an unspoken rule, one that said that the game of politics was about diplomacy, not truth. A game where power was exchanged under the table, and public optics were carefully managed. One evening, as she was leaving her office, a senior Democratic congressman, someone she had worked with on several bills, pulled her aside in the hallway. "Jasmine," he said quietly, looking around as if to ensure no one was listening, "you've made your point, but you've also made enemies. The establishment's not happy with you. You've got to play the game. This isn't the way we do things here." His words hit harder than she expected. She had known the stakes, but to hear it so plainly from someone she had trusted stung. She nodded slowly, forcing herself to maintain composure. "I understand," she said, her voice calm. "But sometimes the game isn't worth playing if it's rigged from the start." The congressman gave her a tight-lipped smile, the kind people use when they know you've made your choice, but they don't agree with it. "Just remember, you can't fight this fight alone." But she wasn't alone. Not really. Outside, her base of support was growing every day. The call to action that she had sparked was palpable. Grassroots organizations, union leaders, and environmental groups, people who had long been left behind by a broken political system, were now seeing Crockett as their advocate, their voice. Donations poured into her campaign. Volunteers called her office, asking how they could help. The American public was responding to something they hadn't seen in years. A politician who was willing to take a stand, even when it meant going up against the establishment. Still, as her support grew, so did the scrutiny. The media, initially focused on the scandalous revelations about Manchin, began to dig deeper into Crockett's background. Reporters combed through her voting history, her previous speeches, searching for something, anything, that could undermine her credibility. It wasn't just Manchin who had enemies in Washington. Now she had them too. In the days following her press conference, a second wave of stories emerged, this time aimed squarely at her. Critics called her reckless, too bold, a threat to party unity. The attacks were not as public as the media coverage of Manchin's corruption, but they were there, whispered into the ears of influential figures in Congress, shared behind closed doors, and printed in op-eds that claimed her methods were too extreme. But Crockett didn't back down. If anything, the attacks fueled her resolve. She had come into this job with one purpose: to represent those who had been ignored for too long. The coal miners, the teachers, the working-class families who had been left behind by both parties. She would not let the fear of losing her place at the table silence her. Meanwhile, Manchin, whose position had seemed unassailable for so long, was now struggling to regain his footing. He hadn't left his office for 48 hours after the ethics investigation was announced. His staff confirmed he was preparing a response, but no one knew when or how it would come. His silence was his way of reasserting control, but in doing so, he had revealed just how much power he was losing. The public investigation into his conflicts of interest was a turning point, one that no amount of political maneuvering could easily undo. And Crockett knew this was only the beginning. The media would continue to cover the story. The pressure would mount. But now the question wasn't whether Manchin would survive the investigation. It was whether the system that had allowed him to thrive would survive the scrutiny she had sparked. In the days that followed, Crockett found herself faced with yet another question. What price would she pay for this fight? The pressure from inside her party had begun to mount. Some leadership members suggested she tone down her rhetoric, be more diplomatic. They knew as she did that she was standing on dangerous ground. If they couldn't control the narrative, they would risk losing it all. But Crockett wasn't afraid. She had already paid a price, one that was too high for her to back down now. She had stood up, and the people had responded. It was no longer just about her. It was about all those who had been silenced, about all those who had been ignored. She had spoken the truth, and now the cost of that truth would be measured not in popularity or party loyalty, but in something far more important: the integrity of the fight itself. As the story reached its peak and the battle lines were drawn, there was one truth that couldn't be ignored. The cost of fighting for what's right isn't just paid in votes, it's paid in silence, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand alone. The aftermath of the investigation and the growing tension inside and outside Congress exposed more than just the fight between one woman and one senator. It revealed the nature of a system that thrives on silence and complicity, one that encourages a facade of fairness while supporting those who play the game by bending the rules. Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply challenging Joe Manchin. She was challenging an entire political ecosystem, one built on backdoor deals, unspoken alliances, and the quiet suffering of everyday people who never got a seat at the table. In a world where personal ambition often trumps public good, where corporate interests outweigh the voices of the people, speaking out against the powerful carries consequences. It always has. But Crockett's willingness to take that stand, despite the price, was a powerful reminder of the human cost of truth and justice. What she faced was more than just opposition from political figures who felt threatened by her actions. It was a system built to keep people like her in their place. Every move she made, every word she said, had consequences far beyond her own career. The pressure from her own party, the attacks from the opposition, and the strain on her personal life were all parts of the heavy toll she paid for choosing to fight for the people, not for political gain. Manchin, a man who had spent years climbing the political ladder, was not just a symbol of power. He was a symbol of the system itself, one that took more than it gave, one that rewarded loyalty over integrity, and one that used the very resources meant to uplift communities as tools to further its own agenda. His reaction to Crockett's questions wasn't just a defensive move. It was a reflection of a deeper fear, the fear of losing control, the fear of a system that had held power for so long being exposed for what it truly was. But Crockett didn't back down. In fact, the more they tried to silence her, the louder her voice became. She understood the risks, the personal sacrifices, and the price that came with it. But she also understood that sometimes standing up for the truth means standing alone. It means not waiting for others to agree with you, but doing what's right anyway. Her journey was a stark reminder of the role each of us plays in upholding justice. It's easy to sit back and wait for change to happen, to hope that others will fight the battles that matter. But as Crockett's story unfolded, it became clear that real change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from taking risks, from challenging the status quo, and from being willing to pay the price for the greater good. It comes from the belief that the truth, no matter how painful, will always rise to the surface if given the chance. Crockett's message wasn't just for the people in that room or the viewers watching from home. It was for everyone who had ever felt powerless, marginalized, or ignored. It was for the workers whose jobs were taken away by corporate greed, for the families who suffered in silence because they didn't have a voice in the conversation. It was a call to arms for the people who were tired of seeing the same faces in power, who were tired of promises made and never kept. She was fighting for them, the ones who were afraid to speak out because they feared the consequences, the ones who had been let down by a system that wasn't designed to help them. Her refusal to be silenced was the beginning of a larger movement, one that was fueled not by ambition or personal gain, but by a genuine desire to restore justice. And as the pressure mounted, it became clear that the fight she had started wasn't just for one election cycle or one political issue. It was for a future where the system could be reshaped, where power could be reclaimed by the people it was meant to serve. But even as the movement grew, Crockett faced opposition that sought to diminish her message. There were whispers from her colleagues, quiet conversations behind closed doors, questioning her methods, her approach, and her willingness to disrupt the flow of politics as usual. They called her reckless, naive, and too bold. But the truth she spoke was never reckless, it was necessary. Her boldness wasn't born from a desire for recognition. It was born from a deep, unshakable belief that change could only come if people like her were willing to risk everything to make it happen. As the days passed, the pressure continued to mount. The media scrutinized every move she made, and her allies began to distance themselves, unsure of how to support a figure who was shaking the foundation of their own comfortable positions. But Crockett remained resolute. She didn't let the whispers or the criticisms pull her off course. She knew the stakes. She knew the risks. And still, she stood. The real lesson of her journey wasn't just about confronting a corrupt system. It was about the costs of speaking truth to power. It was about understanding that when the system is rigged, the only way to change it is to break it. And that's what Crockett did. She broke the system open with her questions, with her refusal to accept the status quo, and with her unwavering belief that the people's voice deserved to be heard. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.